I renew to you all today. Alongside the personal grief that all my family are feeling, we also share with so many of you.
At 7:14 a.m. on December 9th, a document buried for 27 years emerged from the royal archives. King Charles discovered a hidden clause in Princess Diana's will, one that no one knew existed. What it reveals has left Prince William absolutely stunned and could change everything we thought we knew about Diana's final wishes. What did Diana foresee that forced her to hide this provision for nearly 3 decades? Stay tuned to know how the royal family reacts to the new development. The morning everything changed. The announcement hit like a thunderclap on a winter morning that had begun in perfect silence. Across Britain, the first light of dawn was just breaking through thick December clouds when the words appeared on screens everywhere. Royal Archives confirmed discovery of previously unknown provision in Princess Diana's estate documents. It wasn't dramatic in its phrasing. It didn't need to be. The weight carried itself. Across the Atlantic, where it was just past 2 in the morning, the reaction was no less immediate. CNN interrupted its late-night programming with a breaking banner. Hidden clause in Princess Diana's will, discovered after nearly 3 decades. The anchor leaned forward, visibly shaken, explaining that documents related to Princess Diana's estate, documents believed to have been fully disclosed in 1998, contained provisions that were never made public. And according to sources close to Buckingham Palace, what these provisions revealed was deeply consequential for the royal family. On CBS, the late shift anchor described the discovery as unprecedented in modern royal history. American audiences, especially those over 50 who remembered the Diana years with vivid clarity, felt a strange collision of nostalgia and unease. Diana had been gone since 1997. Her will had been made public, scrutinized, and settled, or so everyone believed. The idea that something had remained hidden all this time felt almost impossible. But what made the morning of December 9th so unsettling wasn't simply the revelation that a clause existed. It was the timing. King Charles, now in the 2nd year of his reign, had been working tirelessly to modernize the monarchy. He had streamlined operations, reduced the number of working royals, and distanced the crown from controversies tied to Prince Andrew. The last thing anyone expected was for Diana's legacy to resurface in such a dramatic, legally binding way. King Charles sat alone in his study, staring at a photocopy of the document that had just been authenticated by the royal archivist. The clause itself was brief, no more than 3 paragraphs tucked into the final section of Diana's last will and testament. But its implications were anything but small. What Diana had written in those lines, what she had ensured would remain legally enforceable even decades after her death, carried the power to reshape the financial and emotional landscape of the royal family. For William, the discovery was devastating. He had spent his entire adult life carefully managing his mother's legacy, protecting her memory from exploitation, and ensuring her values lived on through his own work. He had raised his children with Diana's compassion, her warmth, her commitment to humanitarian causes. But now, a document written when he was just 15 years old had emerged from the shadows, and it revealed something about his mother's final wishes that he had never known. The global media storm intensified by the hour. British tabloids scrambled to piece together what the hidden clause might contain. American networks brought in royal historians, estate lawyers, and former palace insiders to speculate on the legal ramifications. Social media exploded with theories, some plausible, some wildly sensational, but the truth, locked inside the walls of Buckingham Palace, remained elusive. By mid-morning, the palace issued a brief statement confirming that newly discovered provisions within Princess Diana's estate documents were under review by legal counsel. The statement was careful, measured, and deliberately vague. It acknowledged the discovery without revealing its contents. It confirmed authenticity without offering explanation. And it left the entire world waiting, wondering, and desperate for answers. Princess Anne, who had lived through the turbulence of Diana's years in the royal family, received the news with her characteristic stoicism. She understood better than most how fragile the monarchy's public image could be. She also understood that Diana, even in death, had never been predictable. If Diana had embedded a clause designed to surface decades later, Anne knew it would not be accidental. It would be strategic. Queen Camilla, reviewing the situation from Clarence House, felt a familiar tightness in her chest. She had spent years rebuilding her reputation, navigating the long shadow Diana cast over the monarchy. She had accepted that Diana's memory would always hold a sacred place in the public imagination, but this, a legal provision emerging now, felt like a ghost stepping back into the present. And ghosts, Camilla knew, had a way of unsettling even the steadiest ground. By noon, the story had spread across every continent. From Sydney to New York, from Berlin to Tokyo, people who had watched Diana's funeral procession in 1997 now found themselves revisiting that grief, that loss, that unresolved ache. For many, especially older viewers who had followed Diana's journey from shy bride to global icon, the discovery felt deeply personal. It was as though Diana herself had reached forward through time, ensuring her voice would be heard one more time. Outside, London moved forward as it always did. But inside the palace, time had slowed to a crawl. The monarchy, an institution that prided itself on continuity and predictability, had been thrown into uncharted territory, and the man at the center of it all, King Charles, faced a truth he had long avoided. Diana's final wishes had not been fully honored, and now, nearly 3 decades later, the reckoning had arrived. The hidden clause no one knew existed. To understand how a clause in Princess Diana's will could remain hidden for 27 years, we must step back into the chaotic months following her death in August 1997. The world was in mourning. Britain was paralyzed by grief. And inside the royal legal offices, officials faced the enormous task of managing an estate that belonged to one of the most famous women in history. Diana's will had been drafted in June 1993, just months after her separation from Prince Charles was formalized. At the time, she was 31 years old, deeply uncertain about her future, and acutely aware that her life carried risks most people would never face. She worked closely with a trusted solicitor, a man known for his discretion and his ability to navigate the complex intersection of royal protocol and personal autonomy. The will itself was straightforward in most respects. Diana left the bulk of her estate, estimated at £21 million, to be divided equally between William and Harry. Her personal belongings, jewelry, clothing, photographs were distributed among godchildren, close friends, and her beloved butler, Paul Burrell. Charitable donations were specified, trustees were appointed. Everything appeared orderly, carefully planned, and legally sound. But what almost no one knew, not even Charles at the time, was that Diana had included a secondary provision, a clause designed to activate only under very specific circumstances. And those circumstances, written in language so precise it could only have been intentional, would not come into effect until both of her sons had reached the age of 40. William turned 40 in June 2022. Harry turned 40 in September 2024. And it was only during a routine estate audit conducted in late November 2024, an audit triggered by updated inheritance tax legislation, that the clause was finally discovered. The legal team reviewing Diana's estate files found it buried in an appendix, a section of the will that had been sealed by court order in 1998 to protect the privacy of Diana's sons during their minority. Once William and Harry reached adulthood, the seal was partially lifted, but the appendix, marked as contingent provisions, had never been fully examined. It sat, untouched and unnoticed, in the royal archives for over 2 decades. When the senior archivist finally opened the file on November 30th, she knew immediately that what she was reading was significant. She contacted the palace legal office within the hour. By December 1st, King Charles had been briefed. By December 5th, William was informed. By December 9th, the palace could no longer contain the discovery. The news had leaked, not through official channels, but through a junior solicitor who mentioned the find to a colleague, who mentioned it to a journalist, who confirmed it with a secondary source. Within hours, the story was everywhere. The clause itself was deceptively simple. Diana had established a secondary trust, one that would only activate once both William and Harry had turned 40. The trust contained funds set aside specifically for the protection and well-being of her sons in the event that they faced financial hardship, reputational crisis, or estrangement from the royal institution. In other words, Diana had anticipated, with eerie accuracy, that her sons might one day need resources independent of the crown. The financial sum was significant. Diana had instructed her trustees to invest a portion of her estate, approximately £3 million, into a long-term growth portfolio. Over 27 years with careful management and compound interest, that sum had grown to approximately £12 million. The trust stipulated that William and Harry were to receive equal access to the funds, but only if certain conditions were met. The first condition was straightforward. The funds could only be accessed if one or both sons formally separated from active royal duties. The second condition was more emotionally charged. The trust required that the sons maintain a documented relationship with their mother's charitable legacy, specifically her work with landmine victims, homelessness charities, and HIV awareness campaigns. The third condition, the one that stunned everyone who read it, stated that the funds could not be accessed if either son was found to have publicly disparaged the other. Diana, it seemed, had foreseen the fractures that would one day divide her family. She had anticipated that William and Harry might walk different paths. She had worried that they might lose each other in the process, and she had built a safeguard, a financial and emotional failsafe, designed to protect them both while encouraging reconciliation. For the palace, the discovery created an immediate dilemma. The trust was legally binding. The conditions were clear. And under current circumstances, Harry, having stepped back from royal duties in 2020, technically qualified for access. But the third condition, the one requiring that neither brother publicly disparage the other, created a complication no one had anticipated. Over the past 4 years, Harry had made numerous public statements, in interviews, in his memoir, in the Netflix documentary, that criticized William directly and indirectly. William, for his part, had remained publicly silent, but palace sources had confirmed tensions, disagreements, and a complete breakdown in communication. The question now facing the royal legal team was whether Harry's public criticisms disqualified him from accessing the trust Diana had created specifically to protect him. The implications stretched far beyond money. If Harry was denied access, it would confirm, in legal terms, that the brothers' rift was irreparable. If he was granted access, it would require the palace to acknowledge that Diana's provisions superseded royal preference. Either way, the monarchy found itself bound by the wishes of a woman who had died nearly 3 decades earlier, a woman whose influence had never truly faded. As December 9th drew to a close, one thing had become painfully clear. Diana's hidden clause was not just a legal document, it was a message, written in the only language that could transcend time. And that message, addressed to her sons, to Charles, and to the institution that had both elevated and confined her, was unmistakable. Protect each other, honor the past, and remember that blood, in the end, matters more than crowns. The warning signs. Throughout the years, the discovery of Diana's hidden clause didn't happen suddenly. Like most revelations that shake institutions to their core, it arrived after months of small, overlooked warnings that only began to make sense once the full picture emerged. Throughout the autumn of 2024, a series of quiet irregularities had been building inside the royal legal and archival systems, and those closest to the palace machinery, particularly Catherine and Princess Anne, had noticed the signs long before anyone understood what they meant. The first sign came in early September, just days after Harry's 40th birthday. A senior trustee from Diana's estate, a man who had remained silent and faithful to his duties for nearly 3 decades, sent an unusual request to the palace legal office. He asked for clarification on the activation protocols for contingent trust provisions. The language was formal, almost cryptic, but it carried an urgency that caught the attention of a junior legal advisor. The request was filed, logged, and then, inexplicably, buried under more pressing matters related to King Charles's state visit preparations. But the trustee didn't stop there. 2 weeks later, he sent a second letter, this time marked urgent and addressed directly to the master of the household. The letter referenced outdated beneficiary conditions and requested immediate review before year-end tax filings. Again, the request was acknowledged, but not prioritized. Palace staff, overwhelmed with the demands of a modernizing monarchy, assumed it was routine estate maintenance. No one imagined it was connected to something far more consequential. The second sign appeared in late September, and it was Catherine who noticed it first. She had been reviewing heritage documentation for an upcoming exhibition honoring Queen Elizabeth's reign when she came across a reference to Diana's archived personal papers. The notation seemed ordinary at first, but something about the wording felt off. The file indicated that certain estate documents remained under conditional seal, pending the fulfillment of temporal beneficiary requirements. Catherine, who had spent years navigating the labyrinth of royal record-keeping, knew that sealed documents were common, but temporal beneficiary requirements was not standard legal language. It suggested something tied to age, to time, to a future activation. She flagged the entry and passed it to a palace archivist for clarification. The archivist promised to investigate, but weeks passed without follow-up. Catherine, occupied with her children's school schedules and her public engagements, didn't press further, but the unease lingered. The third sign came from Princess Anne, whose instinct for institutional irregularities had been sharpened by decades of service. In early October, she attended a private meeting at Windsor reviewing the annual audit of grace and favor properties and royal estate allocations. During the presentation, a financial officer mentioned that Diana's estate trust fund had generated unexpected residual growth over the past quarter. Anne's eyes narrowed. Diana's estate had been settled in 1998. There should be no residual growth unless funds had been held in a separate, actively managed trust. She asked a direct question. Why was Diana's estate still generating reportable income? The officer stammered, admitting he didn't have full details but would investigate. Anne made a note in her personal files. Something about the response felt deliberately evasive. The fourth sign emerged in mid-October when the palace legal team began preparing for routine estate compliance reviews required under updated inheritance tax legislation. A senior solicitor, tasked with cross-referencing historical royal wills, discovered a discrepancy in the archival index. Diana's will, according to the master registry, contained 7 primary sections, but the digitized version available to the legal team showed only 6. The missing section was labeled Appendix C, Contingent Provisions. The solicitor assumed it was a filing error, a document mislabeled during the transition to digital record-keeping in the early 2000s. He requested the original file from the Royal Archives. The archivist, following protocol, retrieved the sealed box containing Diana's estate documents. When she opened it, she found the missing appendix still bound in its original envelope, marked with a handwritten note, to be reviewed only upon the 40th birthdays of both sons. The archivist's hands trembled slightly as she read the note. She immediately informed the head of the Royal Archives, who contacted the palace legal office. By late October, the envelope had been carefully opened, its contents photographed, and its implications assessed by a small, discreet team of senior advisors. What they found inside was far more significant than anyone had anticipated. The fifth and final sign came in early November when King Charles received a confidential briefing about the discovered appendix. He sat in his study at Clarence House, the winter light pale and cold through the windows, reading the clause Diana had written more than 30 years earlier. His face, normally composed, showed signs of deep distress. He asked his private secretary a single question. "Does William know?" The answer was no, not yet. Charles requested that William be informed privately before any public disclosure. He wanted his son to hear the news from family, not from legal advisors or palace staff. But before that conversation could happen, the discovery leaked. A junior solicitor, overwhelmed by the weight of what he had learned, mentioned the find to a trusted colleague outside the palace. The colleague, believing the information would eventually become public, confirmed details with a journalist, and by December 9th, the secret was out. Looking back, the signs had been there all along. The trustees' urgent letters, Catherine's unease over the sealed documents, Anne's suspicion about residual estate income, the missing appendix in the archival index, each warning, ignored or delayed, had created a path toward the inevitable moment when Diana's hidden clause would finally surface. And now, with the truth exposed, the royal family faced a reckoning that none of them, not even Diana herself, could have fully predicted. Behind closed doors, the royal confrontation. The morning of December 6th began in silence at Clarence House. King Charles had requested a private meeting, one that would include only William, Princess Anne, and Queen Camilla. No aides, no private secretaries, no staff beyond the door. What needed to be discussed could not risk being overheard or misinterpreted. The weight of what had been discovered demanded absolute discretion. The room chosen for the meeting was the oak study, a smaller, more intimate space than the formal chambers typically used for royal discussions. A fire crackled in the hearth, but the warmth did little to soften the tension that filled the air. Outside, frost clung to the windows, and the December sky hung. Low and gray, pressing down on the city like a held breath. Charles sat at the head of the table, his hands resting on a leather folder that contained photocopies of Diana's hidden clause. His face looked drawn, older than it had just weeks before. He had spent the previous night rereading the document, trying to understand what Diana had intended, what she had foreseen, and why she had chosen to keep this provision hidden for so long. William arrived precisely on time, his expression unreadable. He wore the careful composure he had perfected over years of public life, but those who knew him well could see the strain beneath the surface. His jaw was tight, his shoulders tense, and his eyes carried a heaviness that had not been there the week before. Princess Anne entered last, her presence as steady and unyielding as always. She nodded briefly to Charles and took her seat without ceremony. Camilla sat quietly to Charles's right, her hands folded in her lap, her face reflecting a mix of concern and caution. She knew this conversation would be difficult, and she knew her role was to listen, not to lead. Charles opened the folder slowly and slid a copy of the document across the table to William. For a long moment, William stared at the pages without touching them. Then he picked them up, his hands steady despite the storm building inside him. He read the clause in silence. His eyes moved over the words once, then again, as if hoping the meaning might change upon a second reading. But it didn't. Diana had written a trust provision that would activate only after both of her sons turned 40. She had set aside millions of pounds to protect them from financial hardship or estrangement from the royal institution, and she had included a condition that neither son could access the funds if they had publicly disparaged the other. William set the pages down carefully, his breath slow and controlled. His mother had known. Somehow, 3 decades ago, she had known that he and Harry might one day drift apart. She had anticipated the possibility of conflict, of distance, of words spoken in anger that could not be taken back, and she had tried, in the only way she could, to protect them from that future. Anne broke the silence with her characteristic directness. She had read the clause days earlier and had spent the time since considering its implications. The trust is legally binding. The conditions are clear. The question now is whether Harry's public statements disqualify him from access. Charles looked at William, waiting for a response. But William said nothing. His mind was racing through memories, moments with his mother, conversations he barely remembered from childhood, the last summer they spent together before she died. He thought about the letter she had written him just weeks before the crash, a letter he still kept locked away. Diana had told him to always look after Harry, to be the steady one, the protector. And now her will was asking him to decide whether his brother had broken the bond she had tried so hard to preserve. Camilla spoke softly, her voice careful. This isn't just about money, it's about what Diana believed. She wanted you both to stay connected. She wanted to give you a reason to reconcile. William looked up, his expression pained. She also gave us a condition we can't meet. Harry has spent years criticizing me publicly. Does that void her wishes? Or does it prove exactly why she wrote this clause? Anne leaned forward. The question isn't what Harry has done. The question is what you will do with this information. Diana left this provision for a reason. Whether it becomes a weapon or a bridge is now your decision. Charles exhaled slowly, his shoulders heavy. William, I won't force your hand. But you need to know that if this goes to the executors, they will interpret the clause as written, and under that interpretation, Harry may be disqualified. William stared at the document again, the words blurring slightly as exhaustion pulled at him. His mother had tried to protect them both, but in doing so, she had also created a test, one that would force him to choose between honoring her wishes and acknowledging the reality of a relationship that had already fractured beyond repair. The fire crackled softly in the silence. Outside, the December cold deepened, and inside the oak study, the future of Diana's final gift hung in the balance, waiting for the son she had raised to be king to make the hardest decision of his life. What the clause actually reveals. The legal language of Diana's hidden clause was precise, almost clinical in its construction, but beneath the formal phrasing lay something far more human, a mother's desperate attempt to shield her sons from a future she could see forming even as they were still children. What the clause revealed, when stripped of its legal framing, was not just financial planning. It was a roadmap of Diana's deepest fears and her last act of protection. The primary provision was straightforward. Diana had set aside £3 million from her estate, instructing her trustees to invest it conservatively over time. The funds were to remain untouched until both William and Harry reached the age of 40. By the time that milestone arrived, the investment had grown to approximately £12 million, a sum large enough to provide genuine security, but not so extravagant as to invite controversy. But the conditions attached to the trust were what made the provision extraordinary. The first condition stated that the funds could only be accessed if one or both sons formally separated from active royal duties. Diana had understood, even in 1993, that the institution could be suffocating. She had lived through the pressures, the scrutiny, the loss of autonomy. She wanted her sons to know that if they ever chose to step away, if the weight of the crown became unbearable, they would have the means to survive independently. This condition was particularly significant in light of Harry's departure from royal life in 2020. His decision to step back, to move to California with Meghan, had been framed by critics as reckless and financially irresponsible. But Diana had anticipated this exact scenario. She had known that one of her sons might need an escape, and she had built one into her will. The second condition tied the trust to Diana's charitable legacy. Any son accessing the funds was required to maintain documented involvement with causes Diana had championed: landmine removal, homelessness prevention, and HIV awareness. This wasn't simply a financial requirement. It was Diana's way of ensuring that her values, the compassion and humanity she had fought to bring into the monarchy, would continue through her sons even if they left the institution behind. For William, this condition presented no conflict. He had spent his entire adult life honoring his mother's legacy through his own charitable work. But for Harry, the requirement added complexity. His charitable efforts in recent years had focused on mental health and veterans support, causes that overlapped with Diana's values, but were not explicitly connected to her signature campaigns. Whether this met the condition's requirements would depend on how strictly the executors chose to interpret Diana's language. The third condition was the most emotionally devastating. The trust stipulated that neither son could access the funds if they had engaged in sustained public disparagement of the other. Diana had not defined what constituted disparagement, leaving the interpretation open to legal debate, but the intent was unmistakable. She wanted her sons to protect each other, to defend each other, to remain united even if the world around them fractured. This was where the clause became a weapon as much as a gift. Over the past 4 years, Harry had made numerous public statements criticizing William. In interviews, he had questioned William's judgment. In his memoir, he had described physical altercations and emotional distance. In the Netflix documentary, he had implied that William was trapped in a system that valued duty over humanity. None of these statements were legally actionable, but they were public, documented, and difficult to ignore. William, for his part, had remained silent. He had not responded publicly to Harry's criticisms. He had not defended himself in interviews or written rebuttals. His silence had been interpreted by some as dignity, by others as cold detachment. But under Diana's clause, his silence might actually work in his favor. He had not disparaged Harry. He had simply stopped engaging. The financial implications of the clause were significant, but the emotional implications were far greater. If Harry was denied access to the trust, it would confirm that his public criticisms had cost him something tangible, something his mother had specifically set aside for his protection. It would turn Diana's gift into a judgment, a posthumous consequence for choices she could never have fully understood. If Harry was granted access despite his public statements, it would suggest that Diana's priority was protection over reconciliation, that she valued her son's independence more than their unity. It would also create a difficult precedent for William, who would have to accept that his brother could benefit from their mother's foresight while continuing to criticize him publicly. For King Charles, the clause created an impossible situation. As the executor of Diana's estate, he had the authority to interpret the conditions and make a final determination. But any decision he made would be scrutinized, questioned, and weaponized. If he ruled in Harry's favor, he would be accused of favoritism and weakness. If he ruled against Harry, he would be accused of cruelty and institutional bias. The clause also revealed something profoundly sad about Diana's final years. She had written this provision in 1993, just 2 years before her infamous Panorama interview, 4 years before her death. She was 31 years old, separated from Charles, navigating a hostile royal system and already imagining a future where her sons might need protection from the very institution she had married into. She had seen the cracks forming. She had felt the pressures that would one day push her sons in different directions. And she had done the only thing she could. She had written a safety net into her will, hoping it would never be needed, but ensuring it would be there if the worst came to pass. As the contents of the clause became clearer to those inside the palace, one truth emerged that no one could deny. Diana had been right. Her sons had drifted apart. The institution had failed to protect their bond. And now, nearly 3 decades after her death, her final wish, that William and Harry remain united, stood as both a gift and a test neither of them knew how to pass. The fallout across 3 continents. The revelation of Diana's hidden clause sent shockwaves across the world, but the reactions differed sharply depending on where people were watching from. In Britain, the United States, and across Commonwealth nations, the discovery triggered debates that went far beyond royal gossip. It touched on legacy, family loyalty, and the question of whether the past should govern the present. In Britain, the response was measured but deeply divided. Older viewers, particularly those over 50, who had lived through Diana's tumultuous years in the royal family, felt a strange mixture of sadness and vindication. Many called into BBC radio programs expressing sympathy for Diana's foresight. She knew what was coming, one caller said. She knew her boys would need protecting from that institution. Others were less sympathetic, arguing that Diana's clause was interfering with the monarchy's ability to move forward. The Times ran an editorial suggesting that wills written decades ago should not dictate modern royal policy. The British tabloids, predictably, exploded with speculation. The Daily Mail published a front-page headline asking, "Did Diana predict Harry's betrayal?" The Sun went further, framing the clause as Diana's final warning to spare Harry. Online commentators debated endlessly whether Harry's public criticisms of William violated the spirit of his mother's wishes. Polls showed the public split almost evenly on whether Harry should be allowed to access the trust. Across the Atlantic, American audiences reacted with far more emotion. For many in the United States, especially those who had followed Meghan and Harry's journey closely, the clause was seen as proof that Diana had anticipated the institutional cruelty her younger son would face. CNN devoted an entire evening segment to analyzing the trust, with legal experts concluding that Diana had essentially created a safety net for a son who might one day be exiled. MSNBC framed it as a mother's love transcending death, while CBS highlighted the tragic irony that Diana's attempt to unite her sons might actually deepen their divide. American social media exploded with support for Harry. Hashtags like Diana Knew and Protect Harry trended for days. Younger viewers saw the clause as validation of everything Harry had said about the monarchy being cold, rigid, and unwilling to protect those who didn't conform. Older American viewers, particularly women who remembered watching Diana's wedding in 1981, felt the clause was a gut-wrenching reminder of how much Diana had suffered and how desperately she had tried to shield her children from the same fate. Inside Buckingham Palace, the staff reaction was more subdued, but no less significant. Senior aides privately admitted they were relieved the clause had finally surfaced. For years, they had operated under the assumption that Diana's estate had been fully settled. The discovery meant revisiting decades-old decisions, but it also provided clarity. Now they knew exactly what Diana had intended, and the institution could no longer pretend otherwise. Some staff members expressed sympathy for William, who now carried the burden of interpreting his mother's wishes while managing his own grief and frustration over Harry's departure. Others quietly sided with Harry, believing that Diana's clause proved the institution had failed him just as it had failed his mother. In California, Harry's response was carefully controlled. Sources close to the Sussexes indicated that he had not known his mother had planned for this. He had not realized she had foreseen a future where he might need financial independence from the crown. The discovery validated his decision to leave, but it also reopened wounds he had spent years trying to heal. Meghan, according to insiders, supported Harry fully but urged caution. She understood that any public statement could be used against them, and she worried that the British press would twist Harry's response into further evidence of disloyalty. Meanwhile, international legal experts weighed in on the implications. Lawyers in the United States and the United Kingdom debated whether Harry's public statements truly constituted disparagement under the terms of Diana's clause. Some argued that criticizing the institution was not the same as attacking his brother personally. Others contended that Harry's memoir had crossed a line by detailing private family conflicts. As December progressed, one thing became clear. Diana's hidden clause had done exactly what she might have feared. Instead of uniting her sons, it had given the world one more reason to take sides, and in doing so, it had turned her final act of love into another battleground in a war that showed no signs of ending. The truth behind Diana's final wishes. As the dust began to settle over the revelation of Diana's hidden clause, a deeper truth emerged, one that transcended legal language and financial provisions. What Diana had written into her will was not simply a safety net for her sons. It was a reflection of the fears that haunted her final years and a message to a future she would never live to see. Diana had drafted her will in June 1993, during one of the darkest periods of her life. Her marriage to Charles had collapsed. The palace had grown hostile toward her. The press, once adoring, had turned invasive and cruel. She was 31 years old, a mother of 2 young boys, and she understood with painful clarity that her life was fragile. She had already begun to suspect that powerful forces wanted her silenced, marginalized, or removed entirely from the royal narrative. In that context, the hidden clause was not paranoia. It was preparation. Diana knew that William, as the future king, would always have the protection of the institution, but Harry, the spare, would be expendable. She worried that if Harry ever challenged the system, if he ever chose a path that diverged from royal expectations, he would be cast aside without resources or support. And so she built him an escape route, one that would only activate if her worst fears came true. But Diana also understood something deeper. She knew that the greatest threat to her sons would not be financial hardship or public scandal. It would be the loss of each other. She had watched Charles and his siblings navigate complex, sometimes fractured relationships under the weight of royal duty. She had seen how the institution prioritized hierarchy over humanity, titles over bonds, and she feared that William and Harry, despite their closeness as children, would one day be pulled apart by the same forces. That fear explains the third condition, the one requiring that neither brother publicly disparage the other. Diana was not trying to silence them or control their relationship from beyond the grave. She was trying to protect them from the one loss she knew would destroy them both: the loss of brotherhood. What makes Diana's foresight so haunting is how accurate it turned out to be. Harry did step away from royal life. He did face financial uncertainty and institutional rejection, and he did, whether intentionally or not, publicly criticize William in ways that deepened the rift between them. Diana had seen it all coming, not because she had special insight, but because she had lived it herself. For William, the clause presents an agonizing dilemma. Honoring his mother's wishes means finding a way to reconcile with Harry, or at least reopening the possibility of reconciliation. But doing so feels impossible after years of public hurt and private betrayal. The clause forces him to confront a question he has avoided for too long. Is protecting his mother's legacy worth risking his own peace? For Harry, the clause is both a gift and a judgment. It proves that his mother understood him, that she anticipated his need for independence and tried to provide for it. But it also holds up a mirror to his choices, asking whether his public criticisms of William were worth the cost. Diana wanted her sons to protect each other. Instead, they have spent years wounding each other in ways she could never have imagined. For King Charles, the clause is a reminder that Diana's influence will never fade. She remains, even in death, a force within the family, shaping decisions and challenging assumptions. Charles must now decide how to interpret her wishes, knowing that any choice he makes will carry consequences for his relationship with both sons. But perhaps the most important truth Diana's clause reveals is this: love, even the deepest love, cannot always prevent pain. Diana tried to protect her sons from the institution that consumed her. She tried to keep them united. She tried to give them freedom and security. But in the end, she could only offer them tools. What they chose to do with those tools, whether they honored her intentions or ignored them, was beyond her control. As December came to a close, the monarchy stood at a crossroads. Diana's hidden clause had forced the family to confront truths they had spent years avoiding. The question now was whether those truths would lead to healing or to further fracture. One thing was certain: Diana had reached across time, not with judgment, but with hope. She had believed, despite everything, that her sons could find their way back to each other. Whether they would prove her right or break her heart one final time remained to be seen, and the world, watching from every corner, waited to see if love, even love written into a will 27 years ago, could still be enough to save a family that had lost its way. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.